All right, cool. So I'm going to be talking today about Linux for CTFs. So you might be asking yourself, why do I care about Linux and what does it have to do with CTFs? So uh, quite a bit of like CTF problems require access to Linux. Uh, so out of all of the categories, web and miscellaneous are probably the only two that can easily be done outside of Linux. Um, the rest require some access to Linux or are just more difficult without Linux. So like binary exploitation is completely impossible on Windows and Mac. Like reversing forensics and crypto are just like kind of annoying on Windows. Um, and then there's also the fact that like most CTF tooling is written specifically for Linux. So if you have access to a Linux machine, you're probably going to be more effective on CTFs. So uh, there's a few options for running a Linux device. So uh, the first of which is the Windows Subsystem for Linux, which is shortened to WSL. Historically, WSL has not had great compatibility with Linux programs, but recently with the release of WSL2, uh, WSL is probably your best bet if you're on Windows. Like it's fairly easy to set up and it is integrated with Windows fairly well. The second option is just running like a virtual machine with Windows or with Linux in it. This is kind of annoying. I'll talk about that more in a minute. And then the third option is just straight up like dual booting Linux and Windows from your computer. So just have a hard drive with both Linux and Windows installed. Um, yeah. So as far as WSL goes, it's a built-in like program to Windows. So if you were on Windows, you would just like open the WSL program and you would have access to essentially what looks like a Linux machine. So it's fairly easy to set up and it's compatible with anything you would need to do. I would recommend this if you're on Windows and you don't want to dual boot. Um, yeah. And the second option is a VM, which is slightly more annoying to set up than WSL. You have to like make decisions about like uh, resource limits that you're going to give it, and it you may or may not have difficulties with like setting up Wi-Fi for your VM. And overall, it just doesn't have very many advantages over WSL. So I don't really see any reason to use it. That said, if you're on Mac, you don't have access to WSL, so some sort of VM would probably be better for you. Yeah, and then the third option is like dual boot. So this is where you install Linux directly onto your computer, and then you would choose between Linux and Windows on boot. This is fairly difficult to set up. I would recommend doing this if you're like an upperclassman and you're taking a bunch of classes that require Linux. Uh, I don't know. Like at the point that I'm at, having direct access to a Linux machine is very useful for me for my classes, and I assume that it's probably a similar situation for other upperclassmen. But if you're an underclassman, like it doesn't really matter. Like 314 and 312 don't really need access to Linux. And the only reason you'd really use it is for like CTFs, stuff like that. That said, if you do want to set it up, I would highly recommend it. It's just kind of a pain, and you may need to do some additional reading. So, as far as installing WSL, uh, you just follow these instructions. So you'd go to like settings, apps, programs, and features. Click on this button, and then go check two options in the menu. Then you'd restart your computer. Um, I don't know if we want to like do this now and then like continue on with the talk because you will have to restart your computer, which might be annoying. Um, how do I see the chat? I see that there's messages. Oh, okay. No, I do not recommend Arch. Ubuntu would probably be uh, like the most like user friendly. Um, so yeah, so if you're going to install WSL, you would do this, um, and then you would follow these instructions as well to enable WSL2, which so I was talking about earlier. WSL1 is like fairly incompatible with a lot of Linux programs, so you want to make sure that you enable WSL2. Um, and I actually had problems with this because I don't use Windows like ever. So when I logged into my Windows machine, it was like super out of date, and I literally could not install WSL2 without updating for like 3 hours. So you need to make sure that you're on like an updated version of Windows if you're going to do this. Cool. Um, yeah, and then I guess these are just more steps for people to follow on their own. Um, feel free to do it at some point. I don't know. It's useful to have WSL. Um, and then if you're on Mac OS, I honestly don't know very much about Mac. I don't use it myself. But from what I Googled, apparently Parallels is a really nice VM manager. And it's literally like a two-step process to get an Ubuntu VM on Mac. So you like install Parallels, you click File New, and then you click Ubuntu, and then you get uh, an Ubuntu VM on Mac. So I don't know. I was kind of surprised. Is Parallels not free? I thought it was free. Oh, that sucks. Never mind. Don't use Parallels. It's apparently not free. Yeah, use like VMware or VirtualBox. Yeah, I think VirtualBox is probably my recommendation if you're going to use a VM. I don't know. I honestly don't know much about Mac. If people want to like post in chat what they would recommend, go for it. And then as far as like Linux programs to install, if you just have like a straight up Linux distribution, it's not going to be super useful for CTFs, just because you don't have any of the utilities that are required to do things with CTFs. So I've listed a bunch of different programs that I would recommend and what categories I would recommend them for. Um, so as far as like just general tools that you will need for CTFs, like general utilities, you probably need Netcat, which is just like a tool for making like raw connections to ports. You'll see this on CTF problems a lot. It'll be like NC and then like an IP address or something like that. So that is Netcat. Uh, you'll probably need that if you do any binary exploitation, some crypto, and some networking. And then Git is just like it's essentially how you get things off of GitHub. So if you want to use any GitHub code, you need Git. Uh, and then Bless is just like a generic hex editor that I would recommend. It's pretty nice. And then for reversing, so Cutter is like a cool UI that like shows you like a graph view of all of the assembly of whatever you're modifying. If you've ever seen somebody like looking at a graph of their assembly, it's Cutter probably. And then Binwalk is less useful, I'd say, if you're given like a firmware image or something like that. Binwalk would be useful for reversing. Um, it essentially looks for files inside of a file and tries to like pull them out. It's also useful for like forensics problems. So sometimes people like hide files in other files, and Binwalk will detect that for you. And then Ghidra is the decompiler that was released by the NSA like, I don't know, 6 or 7 months ago. Um, it's probably more than that, maybe a year ago. Um, yeah, so Cutter and Binwalk are pretty standard to install. Ghidra is kind of annoying. Um, I posted like some instructions to install Ghidra through like an installer that I found on GitHub. I don't know if this installer actually works. I did not personally use it, but hopefully it does. And I Let me know if you have problems with it. Just like DM me on Discord or something. I'll help you figure it out. And then as far as like binary exploitation slash pwn, there are a lot of tools here. So pwn tools is essentially like a Python framework for exploits. I would basically call it like a Python wrapper for Netcat. Um, that's probably the most useful tool out of this list. Second most useful would probably be Jeff. So if you've ever used GDB, like the GNU debugger, um, its default like UI is pretty horrible. It doesn't like give you any uh like any information at all, and you have to like type in commands to get the information. So Jeff just like essentially themes and colors and displays like a bunch of information that's useful when you're debugging. So I'd recommend that. Um, and then ROP Gadget and One Gadget are somewhat specialized tools that uh, will make your job easier. If you don't know what ROP or ret to libc are, maybe don't worry about these tools. But if you do, you should probably look up these tools and figure out what they do. They're super, super useful. And then crypto. So most crypto problems can be done without any like non-standard tools. Like you might need Netcat, you might need to run some Python code. But for like really difficult crypto problems, you end up doing like crazy math. And there's this Python. I, I hesitate to call it a Python library, but that's kind of what it is. It's like a giant math library that like just implements a ton of like super crazy math. I don't know. I think it's fun to go look at the like Sage Math like current issues just to see like what people are implementing in this library. There's literally like so much insane math in this that makes zero sense to me. Yes, this library does contain illegal primes. It also contains illegal elliptic curves. But yeah, would recommend this if you're like trying to get into a harder crypto. Yeah. And then finally, like networking. So Wireshark is probably the main tool that I would recommend for networking. So if you ever get like a PCAP or like, yeah, I guess if you get a PCAP on like a CTF challenge, you need Wireshark to open it. It's just like a capture of packets, and you use Wireshark to see like where data is going, what is being sent. Yeah, I mean that's the end of the actual content for the talk. I guess that was quite a bit shorter than I expected it to be. Um, I don't know if people want to go through these